Questions without notice. Do we have any questions today? The Leader of the Opposition.
Certainly do. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Australian people are sick of this constitutional crisis of eligibility.
Members on my
The
right.
only way to resolve the
The
citizenship
Leader of the Opposition will
crisis—
resume his seat. Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Members on my right will cease interjecting, particularly the Leader of the House. I need to hear the question if members expect me to rule on it. The Leader of the Opposition will begin his question again.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Australian people are sick of this constitutional crisis. The only way to resolve this citizenship crisis is with the cooperation of all sides of parliament. So will the Prime Minister work with the entire parliament, including Labor and the crossbench, to reach agreement on who should be referred to the High Court?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I can tell the honourable member what the Australian people are sick of: the dishonesty, the twists and turns of the Leader of the Opposition, the cover-up. This is a man
Member
who
for
said
Isaacs.
the Labor
The
Party's
member for Isaacs.
vetting was supreme. Oh, he said the Labor Party
The
has
Prime
got
Minister,
very strict
will
vetting.
resume his seat. The member for Isaacs will not bark instructions at me. He'll be out of this House in a second. Well, you can do it at the dispatch box.
I apologise, Mr Speaker.
Member for Isaacs is warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
Get used to it. Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, he said the Labor Party has got very strict vetting processes. We have a strict vetting process, he said. There's no cloud over any of our people. None. Let's be straight here. I assume that included all the British citizens. No cloud over them. No cloud over them. Mr Speaker, he said the Labor Party candidates have an extremely stringent vetting process, and that's why this hasn't happened. I'm not going to jump every time some Liberal gets up with a complaint, he said, because it's a matter of fact that we've got a good vetting procedure. Mr Speaker, again and again and again. But it seemed to overlook the member for Batman, didn't it? It didn't. He lost his papers. Did the dog eat them? Did he leave it in the house he overlooked? I mean, if you can overlook a house, you can presumably overlook a few papers. Mr Speaker, this is where we have the Leader of the Opposition now, twisting and turning in his own incompetence and dishonesty. He has a number of members who we all know knew they were UK citizens at the time they nominated. That's a fact. He also has a senator, Senator Gallagher, in exactly the same position. She has been referred by Senator Wong in the Senate to the High Court. But he doesn't want to refer the people who are in exactly the same position here. Now, where is the logic? Well, yes, I'm so glad to hear from the member for Watson. See, the member for Watson, like his leader, is all politics and no principle. So their idea is they've got people who are dual citizens, and so they think that if the House is going to refer them to the High Court, it should also refer some of ours who are not dual citizens. Work that out. Well, I'll tell you the big difference here. Our colleagues, the Deputy Prime Minister and the member for Bennelong, they went to the member for Deputy PM referred himself to the High Court, and by-election was held and he's back. And the member for Bennelong did the right thing when he accepted that he couldn't establish that which he believed to be true, that he was not a dual citizen. He resigned, and his by-election is going on. That's the big difference between our side and Labor's.
Time
all
has
the cover-ups.
concluded. The member for Banks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on what action the government is taking to make Australian businesses more competitive, grow the economy and create more local jobs? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, nearly 1,000 jobs have been created every day over the last year. 1,000 new jobs a day, direct result of our pro-growth, pro-investment, pro-business policies. We support the policies that make Australian businesses more competitive. Why is that? Because the overwhelming majority of Australians, 86% in fact, are employed by private business. 10.5 million Australians are employed in the private sector, so plainly it is in our interest, our national interest, to ensure that Australian businesses are strong and competitive. The tax cuts that we negotiated through the Senate for small and medium businesses, up to $50 million turnover a year, those tax cuts are enabling those companies to invest more and employ more, and collectively, these businesses overwhelmingly, Australian family-owned businesses, employ half the Australian private sector workforce. So what we're doing is we're backing business, backing investment, getting more employment. That is what we're delivering. And we're backing our manufacturers and big energy users by cutting the cost of power, improving reliability through the National Energy Guarantee. We're opening up big new markets for our exporters, for agriculture and services, with new and enhanced export deals. That is the key to growth. Now, who could be opposed to this? Seriously, who could be opposed to this? Well, I don't have to look far. It's the Leader of the Opposition. You would think this would be bipartisan, and yet reports today in the press by the Miranda Devine's article, we were here today what we've long suspected. No, this is the Leader of the Opposition. This is your leader at the BCA. He told the Business Council of Australia to expect nothing from a Shorten Labor government because, as one of the attendees is reported as saying, he thinks a class war will be good for Labor. Now, he obviously didn't hold those views when he was cozying up to billionaires in Melbourne doing special deals to shortchange his members. I don't think he was running this class war line when he went to visit Mr Wang in Mossman, or perhaps he might have been. Who knows? You never know. He'll say anything to please his audience. The reality is he has no consistency in his support for investment. Labor has not one policy which would encourage one business to invest $1 or hire one more employee. He wants to smash the economy with a $164 billion tax grab. He wants to increase energy prices, and he talks about targeting millionaires. Well, he's only ever targeted them to suck up to them.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. On the 9th of November, the Leader of the House was asked by David Spears, "You're saying if your parents are born overseas and you don't have a document that shows you renounced citizenship, you're off to the High Court." And the Leader of the House answered, "That would be the assumption because that's obviously what the process says." If a government member has acknowledged the existence of such documents in their statement but is keeping the copies secret, will the Prime Minister refer them to the High Court?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, what the Labor Party is seeking to do here is distract attention from the fact that they have on their side members who are plainly at very high risk, I would say, of being found to be ineligible by the High Court. No, well, Mr Speaker, I'm not making any more predictions. I'm down to a 50% ratio.
Members on my left.
I don't want my strike rate to go any lower. Although I was speaking to one of the colleagues here on the crossbench who advised me that his strike rate was 0, so I said, go for your life, it can only get better. But, Mr Speaker, seriously, we have a position where we have Senator Gallagher referred by Labor to the High Court because she was a UK citizen at the time she nominated. Fair enough. Now, she will make an argument that filing the renunciation paper was enough. The High Court will consider that. It is clearly a matter for the court. It is only the High Court can determine that matter, and it's plainly in the public interest that it be determined. This area of the law needs more certainty, needs more clarity, and members who are in her position should go to the High Court for precisely the same reason. If the member for Batman is, as it appears to be, unless he can find some paperwork to the contrary, is in fact a dual citizen right now, he shouldn't be sitting here today. I mean, Mr. Speaker, because he knows that following the High Court's ruling, following the rejection of the arguments the government made to take a more lenient approach, it is a very black-letter law approach to this section. And the fact is that what Labor now wants to do is to create some sense of political equity or balance by referring members on the coalition who are not dual citizens to the High Court. Well, I say to the Leader of the Opposition, if he believes any of our members are dual citizens, well, put up or shut up. Put up or shut up. Actually state the case. Actually state the case. He has no evidence, no basis to make those claims. This is simply a distraction from his hopeless failure on leadership. And of course, it's not just dual citizens he's been covering up for and trying to bamboozle the media with talking about his great vetting procedures. It is also, of course, a senator who has much more than a dual citizenship issue at stake. It's Senator Dastyari. And there the issue is one of loyalty. Who is the Leader of the Opposition loyal to? Is he loyal to Australia and our national interest, or is he loyal to the man who runs the faction
the Prime
put him
Minister
in his job?
seat. The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with great pleasure I ask my question to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline what action the government is taking to support the ongoing success of Australia's $60 billion agriculture sector? Is he aware of any threats that stifle opportunities for hard-working Australian businesses and households?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question and note during the proper process of making sure that we went about letting the High Court make its deliberations, which I accept their verdict, and during the by-election I had the opportunity to get around the electorate, and we see so much that is happening in agriculture. We've seen that table grapes, since we've been in power since 1st of December 2017, or since we've been in power since 2013, have gone up by 276%. We've seen cattle, yearling heifers, 150%. We've seen mutton, 125%, potatoes, 112%. We've seen the biggest turnaround in the agricultural economy by reason of the good fortune of international markets and the good management of a coalition government. We have seen that we have put over $4 billion together we have put money on the table for agricultural white paper. And he's asked if there's threats. Of course, there are a number of threats. The threats are that the Labor Party does not believe in dams. I know you've got Rookwood Weir in your electorate. The Labor Party does not believe in dams. They do not believe in a better nation, a stronger nation. They do not believe in the Inland Rail. They put no money on the table for the Inland Rail. They did not believe in the live cattle trade when they shut it down. They do not believe in actually going out into regional areas to provide the things we have provided, such as the mobile phone towers, so vitally important, such as a Building Better Regions Fund, such as a National Regional Growth Fund. So we have provided 100% write-off for fences, 100% write-off for water, a write-off over 3 years for grain storage, all these things, and we believe in a decentralisation agenda, which we know the Labor Party does not believe in. But the biggest threat I could say to the member of Capricornia is one of trust. And once more I come back and I see the back of the head for the member for Maribyrnong, because they do not trust him. And they do not trust him because of the absolute incredible position that we had the member for Watson come to this dispatch box and up to 11 times tried to gag us. While they were using those numbers, the member for Bateman was voting with them. The member for Batman was voting with them. The member for Senator Gallagher was speaking on their behalf. We also see right now that we have the member for Braddon, the member for Longman, the member for Fremantle. This is an opposition that cannot be trusted by a man who cannot be trusted. He has shown that he will turn his back on the Australian people. He will turn his back on proper process. And since the end of October, where he led the Fourth Estate round by the nose because they trusted him, they believed him, but he's a man who can't be believed. And now we've seen since the end of October, it's quite black and white. Their only excuse, they say, is they haven't got their paperwork back. How does that work? Do you drive on a highway without a licence because you believe it's in the mail? I don't think so. I don't think so. Yet these people are going to continue to vote. Continue to vote. But I can tell you one good thing. The people of New England gave you a vote. 11% is what they gave you.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that he has said about citizenship disclosures, and I quote, "I want everyone to make full disclosures of all the relevant material, and I'm determined that Australians see there is full transparency." If a government member has acknowledged the existence of documentation in their citizenship statement but kept copies secret, will the Prime Minister refer them to the High Court?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, the honourable member might reflect on her own disclosure.
Let's hear about that.
Her parents were born in Slovenia, and she has inquired of the Slovenian consulate, I think, and which provided a statement that she was not a Slovenian citizen, and yet, the Labor Party, when faced with statements from the Greek and Italian embassies and consulates in respect of members opposite, says they are utterly inadequate. The honourable member has got to be consistent. Now, if she has relied on a statement from a representative of the Slovenian government to demonstrate she is not a dual citizen, why will she not accept statements in very similar terms from other governments? And that's the reality. The fact of the matter is very simply this. This is the situation. There are two questions in all of these cases. The first is whether a member is a citizen of a foreign country or not. That is a matter of the foreign law. Who best to state that than the foreign country itself? The next question is, if the person is a citizen of a foreign country at the relevant time, as a number of Labor members were, and indeed several of our members were, then the question is, does Australian law disqualify them? That is something that can only be decided by the High Court. In the case of the Deputy Prime Minister, it was decided against him. He promptly went to a by-election, which he won, and he's back. John Alexander, recognising the approach the High Court set out, unable to demonstrate that the advice he'd had in the past was right, resigned and went to a by-election. Our members have done the honourable thing, the right thing. And what Labor is now seeking to do is to debase this House by not only covering up people they know should go to the High Court, but wanting to refer people to the High Court who are not dual citizens, and they have no basis for claiming that they are. It is simple. This is tit for tat, is no substitute for justice, and the honourable members opposite should reflect on their duty as legislators. The member for Batman should go to the High Court, see how he goes. The other members should go to the High Court, make their argument. We wish them all the very best of luck. It's an uncertain environment down there, believe me. But there it is. The High Court makes the decisions, and they should be allowed to do so.
The member for Melbourne.
My question is to the Minister for the Environment. At recent climate negotiations I attended in Bonn, it was reaffirmed that current commitments are not enough to meet the Paris Agreement goal of staying well below 2 degrees of warming. In fact, Australia's existing paltry 2030 target will contribute to over 3 degrees of warming. Even worse, under your government, Australia's pollution is going up and up and up. Minister, last year you started a climate change policy review to be completed by the end of this year. Will you release the results of this review before the end of the year? And will the new policy increase our pollution reduction commitments to help meet the Paris 2-degree goal? Or under your government will we remain on track for over 3 degrees of warming?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I can inform the House that Australia's emissions on a per capita basis are at its lowest in 27 years, Mr Speaker. In 27 years. And in the most recent data in the electricity sector, the last 2 quarters, emissions have come down, Mr Speaker. And in the land sector, through the Emissions Reduction Fund, through the good work of the member for Flinders, we have contracted for 189 million tonnes of abatement at under $12 a tonne on average, Mr Speaker. And the work through the renewable energy target has seen a 5-fold increase in renewable investment in 2016 compared to 2015. A 5-fold increase, a record amount. And the Prime Minister, through his support through Snowy 2.0, is supporting the largest pumped hydro facility in the Southern Hemisphere, the largest renewable project, bringing on 2,000 megawatts of additional support, Mr Speaker. So the work that the Turnbull government is undertaking to reduce emissions is making a difference. And the advice to the government is that our 2020 target will be met and indeed beaten by some 224 million tonnes. But, Mr Speaker, what we won't do on this side of the House is reduce emissions at the expense of energy affordability and energy reliability, Mr Speaker. We won't sell out the workers at the coal-fired power stations throughout the country, Mr Speaker. Unlike the members opposite, the member for Hunter, who's extremely quiet, who's not prepared to stand up for jobs in his own electorate, Mr Speaker. Unlike the member for Shortland, who turns his head into his papers, who's not prepared to stand up for the workers in his electorate, Mr Speaker. We are taking the steps.
The Minister will resume his seat for a second. The member for Melbourne on a point of order.
On relevance, the question was whether we're going to see the results of the climate policy review before the end of the year.
The member for Melbourne has raised a point of order on relevance. I just point out to him, whilst that was certainly in his question, one of the problems with the 45-second special deal for the crossbench is it necessitates a lot of preamble that widens it. I just make that point without the minister has the call.
And a review, and it will be released in due course. But the point is this, that we have taken steps to reduce our emissions, and that is occurring, and particularly in the electricity sector, in the land sector, through energy productivity in the built environment. We're taking steps to reduce power prices and create a more stable system. But what we will not do, which the Greens and the Labor Party will do, is sell out the workers of Australia.
Just before I call the member for Mackellar, I'd like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable Andrew Thompson, the former member for Wentworth. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on the release of today's national accounts and what these strong figures tell us about growth in our economy? What do these strong figures mean for hard-working Australian families and businesses, and are there any risks associated with alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mackellar for his question. We already knew that in the September quarter that over 100,000 jobs were created in the September quarter. That's more than 1,000 jobs every single day in the September quarter. Now, we know, as the Prime Minister said, we've been averaging around about that figure all year. 1,000 jobs every single day under the Turnbull government. Now, that's almost 4 times what was achieved by the Labor government when they were last in office. The Turnbull government is delivering jobs, but it's not just that, because the Turnbull government is also delivering growth. We went to the Australian people, we promised them jobs and growth is exactly what the Turnbull government is delivering, because the national accounts show today that in the September quarter, through the year growth rose from 1.9% to 2.8%. And this has occurred principally because of the drive in investment that is being created by businesses getting back in there and investing in their businesses. That investment has been supported by the deliberate economic strategy of the Turnbull government to reduce taxes on small and medium-sized businesses legislated, and we want to go further, and the Labor Party is standing in the way. The Turnbull government's policy to invest in new public economic infrastructure, the Turnbull government's plan to continue to open trade so our businesses can grow, our backing of innovation, our backing of start-up businesses, our backing of new reforms which will open the way for small and medium-sized businesses and businesses right across the country to employ more people. Now, we've had 4 quarters now of consecutive increases growth in business investment. New business investment is up 7.5% through the year. Now, compared to 2 years ago, it was -11. It is now plus 7.5, the strongest new business investment growth we've seen since the peak of the mining investment boom. Contribution to growth by investment in this latest quarter is up 3 times what it was in the previous quarter. Public investment in economic infrastructure up 12.6%, and on defence investment it is up more than 30%, supporting new manufacturing jobs and high-tech manufacturing jobs as a result of that investment. Exports are up 6.4%. In the service industry, they're up 10%, and in the agriculture industry, to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister back to the parliament, the figures say they're up more than 20%, Mr Speaker. The Turnbull government's National Economic Plan is delivering the jobs and growth that we promised the Australian people, Mr Speaker. And the alternative from those opposite is an $164 billion tax slug on investment, on housing, on earnings, Mr Speaker. All of this that will suffocate the growth that this government is delivering every day.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. In the last 2 years, the Treasurer wasn't told that the date of the budget had changed, wasn't told about the plan for state income taxes, booked a press club speech to argue for a GST increase only to have the Prime Minister abandon the idea, and was kept in the dark about the Royal Commission terms of reference despite the Minister for Revenue working on them for a long time. Why is the Treasurer always out of the loop? Is it because he's also always out of his depth?
Just before I call the Treasurer, members on my right, I haven't called the Treasurer yet. I just make the point to the member for McMahon. I've always said that I like free-flowing debate, and I don't want to be overly strict with the standing orders. But I make the point to him, perhaps in preparation, that questions like that really mean the Treasurer can say anything he wants in reply to that last point and be relevant. So, the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Taking lessons from the shadow Treasurer on the economy, you got a problem with that? Taking lessons from the shadow Treasurer on the economy is like getting driving lessons from a drunk driver, Mr Speaker. This muppet of a shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker, this muppet, seriously, was the one who was presiding over jobs growth as a Treasurer, which was barely a quarter, Mr. Speaking of muppets, Mr Speaker.
I haven't called the member for McEwen yet. The Treasurer resume his seat. The member for McEwen.
Mr Speaker, I think that the
member for McEwen will come to his point of order. He's not going to tell me what he thinks. He's going to come to the point of order.
That the term that is used against the shadow Treasurer should be withdrawn.
I didn't hear the term. No. Well, the member for McEwen is. If the member for McEwen wants to, even as second Deputy Speaker, argue with me because I didn't hear something in the noise, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to put up with it. I'm really not. You're the second Deputy Speaker. It's ridiculous. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm not surprised that the member for McEwen would answer the call when I would refer to that phrase, Mr Speaker. I'm sure he'd be very quick to hear his name called. Mr Speaker, but on the very broad question put to me by the shadow Treasurer, it gives me the opportunity to refer to some of the things that the Shadow Treasurer has said in recent days. Rather than raising questions about the economy and going off with all this nonsense, because the only way he does his economic research is just reading the newspaper, Mr Speaker, and looking at fictitious reports. Let me remind you what he said to Lee Sales the other day on someone he described as a patriotic and loyal Australian. His good friend, Senator Sam Dastyari, Mr Speaker. He said to Lee Sales, let me make this clear. Sam Dastyari, I'm quoting, Mr Speaker, is a patriotic and loyal Australian. Assertions to the contrary I reject. He made mistakes. He made mistakes. I suspect there's nobody in Australia who couldn't have made a mistake at some point in their career. That's certainly true of the Shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker. And he paid a substantial price. A substantial price. He'll be paying the price for some time. Well, if he's got to pay a price for anything, we know where he'll get the money from, Shadow Treasurer. He'll go to his mates and he'll borrow it, or he'll be given it to by some foreign influence, Mr Speaker, because his best mate, the Shadow Treasurer's best mate, the person he is putting his own credibility on the line for, he has gone to the mattresses, Mr Speaker, for Senator Sam Dastyari. And so if he speaks of this of Senator Dastyari, then we can only assume that he is in complete truck with Senator Dastyari, Mr Speaker, and that is not someone who can be trusted with the Treasury of this nation, Mr Speaker. If he is so quick to stand up for Senator Sam Dastyari, a man who cheated on his country, a man who disgraced the Labor Party, a man who last time he was caught out on this was given a speeding fine or the suspension of his library privileges equivalent, Mr Speaker, and apparently this was some great price that was paid. If that's what the Shadow Treasurer thinks, then he is totally signed up to the Craig Thompson defence for Senator Dastyari. The Shadow Treasurer should be ashamed of himself for supporting such a shameful figure.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is also to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the government is delivering on its commitment to reduce pressure on housing affordability for all Australians, including in my electorate of Robertson and in the electorate of Bennelong? And is the Treasurer aware of any other alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question and her keen interest in issues of housing affordability in her electorate, and not just for those looking to buy a home, but for those who are homeless, those who are dependent on affordable housing and social housing. She's been a champion of that for many years. Last night, and I commend the Assistant Minister to the Treasurer, the member for Deakin, last night the Senate passed the Turnbull government's legislation to give a tax cut to Australians saving for their first home deposit that will help them save 30% faster. That's what happened in the Senate. That will come back here, Mr Speaker, and be supported again by the government. It was in the budget. This isn't a handout. This is practical assistance, Mr Speaker. It's allowing them to pay less tax on their hard-earned savings to buy their first home. Now, if you're saving for your first home in Ryde or Eastwood or Epping or Ermington out there in the electorate of Bennelong, you need to know what the Labor Party did to try and stop your tax cut in this parliament. They voted against it in this chamber. They voted against it in the Senate. The candidate for the member for the seat of Bennelong, Christina Keneally, she's out there supporting the Labor Party's position, which says if you're saving for your first home deposit, you should not get a tax cut. You should have to pay more tax on those savings. You should not be able to accelerate those savings by up to 30% more quickly. Now, Labor is putting the interests of their union boss mates sitting on super fund boards ahead of the interests of first home savers, Mr Speaker. That's who's pulling the Shadow Treasurer's chain. He's the one who's getting all upset that the Royal Commission he asked for is now actually going to look at superannuation funds, the very people he's been trying to protect and run a protection racket for many years, Mr Speaker. Now, we're getting on with the job of addressing housing affordability. We've put $375 million extra into addressing homelessness issues, supporting those programs with the states. Our carefully calibrated measures through APRA, which has seen interest-only lending fall in the September quarter from $30 billion down to $17 billion, that has seen investor housing credit growth, which was just over 0.4%. That was the slowest monthly growth in the past 17 months. We've seen the number of first-home buyer loans in September at 31.3% up over the previous year, and we've seen Sydney dwelling prices growth fall from May of 17.1% down to just 5% through the year in November. The calibrated, careful measures we've been taking to address investor heat in the Sydney and Melbourne housing markets has been having effect, and we're getting a soft landing in those markets, which is good for the economy. Those opposite want to take a chainsaw to the housing market with their housing tax, with no regard, driven by envy, not economics, Mr Speaker, as this mob always is driven by, which would cause immeasurable harm to the Australian economy, crash confidence, and this Leader of the Opposition is a fraud.
The Treasurer will withdraw that term. Yeah.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Last night on 7:30 Report, families of delivery drivers told harrowing stories of unreasonable demands Tip Top made on their contract drivers. One family of a driver told how one night after returning to work after having a lung removed, he called in sick but was told that he was under contract. So he drove until he had to give up work altogether and died later that year. Why did the Prime Minister abolish the Independent Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal and put nothing in its place to ensure safe and fair conditions for contract drivers?
Members on my right. Members on my right. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal, so-called, set up at the behest of the Transport Workers Union, put 50,000 owner drivers off the road. 50,000 owner drivers off the road. Very cosy for the big union and big trucking companies. That's what it was absolutely true. It's absolutely true. Well, the member for Grayndler says it wasn't true. He should have met some of those owner drivers. I tell you, we all did. We all did. He should get out more. He should get out more and meet people that are battling in their small family business to make a living. Now, we take the safety of all road users, including truck drivers, very seriously. It's why we're investing $75 billion in infrastructure from this year over the next decade, including a number of programs that specifically target road safety. Now, Mr Speaker, we listened to the owner drivers. We spoke to hundreds of them, but there were thousands involved, small trucking businesses who were put out of work by the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal, which we were able to abolish. Another great step, a great advance that our government has taken to put small business first. Now, Mr Speaker, we also have provided an additional $4 million a year, which had been Labor had allocated to this tribunal, this anti-family business tribunal, to progress practical initiatives that will improve the safety of the heavy vehicle industry. And they including improving the responsibility, the education responsibility, improving heavy vehicle monitoring, funding for research into heavy vehicle driver fatigue to inform the development of future fatigue arrangements, safer freight networks in high-risk areas, and, of course, black spots, national heavy vehicle safety and productivity and bridges renewal programs. Mr Speaker, we are committed to safer roads and we're committed to backing safe trucking, safety for family businesses, for truckers, whether they're working for themselves or for big companies. We're putting the resources in to back that. Labor set out to put 50,000 families out of business, and had it not been for the Senate voting to abolish that tribunal, those families would be out of work and on the breadline. That's Labor's approach to enterprise and hard-working Australian families. The alternative is what we do, which is to put more money into the pockets of hard-working Australian families, backing investment, backing jobs, backing enterprise. Labor hates that because, as he said to the BCA, he thinks a class war is just the ticket. Well, it's the ticket to disaster for Australia.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Page.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the minister update the House on the importance of a well-managed migration program? Why is it important to maintain a strong and consistent approach to border protection policy? And is the minister aware of any alternate approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and the hard work he does in the electorate of Page. I want to thank all of my colleagues for the work that they do in helping the government to keep our borders secure. We haven't had a death at sea now in over 3 years. We haven't had children put into detention like they were under Labor. We've been able to bring more refugees in a measured way and to provide an opportunity for those people that could never have been imagined. Mr Speaker, we have secured our borders, and it's amazing that members of the Labor Party still to this very day would seek to dismantle the policies which saw this restoration of integrity to our borders. When John Howard left office in 2007, there were 4 people in detention, including no children, and yet Labor presided over 50,000 people on 800 boats. 8,000 children went into detention and 17 detention centres opened, and it was an absolute national disgrace. So imagine our surprise when Christina Keneally, the Labor candidate for Bennelong and factional ally of the Leader of the Opposition, said recently to the Prime Minister that all of the people off the regional processing centres should come to Australia, which is a ticket to people smugglers, to get back into business because they sell their product to innocent men, women and children. Take money from them. They couldn't care less whether those people go to the bottom of the ocean or whether they make it to Australia, and we are not going to allow that to happen, Mr Speaker. Now, there is a lot that we could discuss with the Labor Party. I think there's a lot that the Labor Party could learn from our border protection policies, but I want to update my colleagues. It's been 501 days today since the member for Blair asked a question of me in relation to border protection matters. We contemplated that he may be sedated before he comes into question time. Each time he's clearly with us. There's a smile that's broken onto his face. I think he's hearing what I'm saying but not taking it in. I think that's a problem because, Mr Speaker, he still advocates undoing the policies that have restored integrity to our borders. We are kicking out criminals out of this country that would seek to do harm to children and to women in our country, and yet 2 days in a row he has been supporting Green motions in the Senate which have made our country a less safe place and have made our borders less secure. What he doesn't realise is that one of the motions, which we're going to speak about over the course of the coming days, one of the motions that he supported actually goes against a recommendation made out of the inquiry into Manmonis, out of the terrible siege in Martin Place. I don't think he realises that yet, do you? You've sided with the Greens and you don't understand yet what you've done. I'll give you this assurance. I'm going to explain the detail to you in coming days.
The member for Greenway.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday the Prime Minister tried to deny he had promised that every Australian would have access to minimum speeds over the NBN by the end of 2016. Does the Prime Minister also deny he promised to deliver the NBN for a cost of $29.5 billion? Or is his recollection as unreliable as the HFC network?
The Prime Minister has the choice.
Well, Mr Speaker, that's a very tough one, Mr Speaker. It's a very tough one. Another blow from the opposition. Right, Mr Speaker, let's say it again. The NBN was a complete train wreck under Labor. 6 years, 50,000 activations. Oh, what a great effort. Do you know how many the NBN Co does now? It does more than that every 2 weeks. More than that every 2 weeks. There's over 6.5 million premises to get the service, over 3.25 million premises that have got the service. The reality is this. Labor's approach was a catastrophe. Tens of billions of dollars were wasted and can never be recovered. To fulfil Labor's plan would have taken 6 to 8 years longer and $30 billion more. The approach we are taking is getting the job done. The project will be completed, the company assures us, by 2020. We are getting on with the job and getting it done. We inherited a train wreck from Labor and we're fixing it and delivering it. Labor cannot manage anything. They cannot manage the construction of a broadband network any more than the Leader of the Opposition can manage his fantastic vetting process.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the minister update the House on the government's action to guarantee affordable and reliable energy for hard-working Australians and businesses, including in my electorate and neighbouring communities like Bennelong? How does this compare to the risks associated with alternative approaches?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for North Sydney for his question and know that he's focused on driving lower prices and a more stable energy system for his constituents and right across the country. And he supports the Turnbull government's actions to rein in the power of the networks, to provide more gas to Australians before it's exported overseas, to get a better deal for millions of Australians from retailers, and to put in place the National Energy Guarantee, under which we will see significant savings for Australian consumers. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we know that under federal Labor, when they were last in office, power prices went up 100%. And we also know that when Labor was in office in New South Wales, between 2006 and 2011, power prices went up 60%, Mr Speaker. And do you know who had their hands on the levers of power in New South Wales? It was Kristina Keneally and Senator Sam Dastyari, her personal pick. So you can imagine my surprise when I looked at the Labor Party's website to find there was a special invitation. Christmas trivia with Senator Sam Dastyari and special guest, the Honourable Kristina Keneally, Mr Speaker. Now, a special guest. Now, it was organised by, guess what, the Central Policy Branch, Mr Speaker. I bet they were getting together to work out a Medicare campaign or to drive up energy prices or to drive up taxes, Mr Speaker. And I guess what was on the menu come Christmas time was duck, probably Peking duck, Mr Speaker. But I looked at the price and I thought this could be a good deal. This could be a good deal. What is the price for a trivia night with Senator Sam Dastyari and Kristina Keneally? Well, it was $150, Mr Speaker. I thought this is a pretty good deal. Senator Sam Dastyari is coming at a good price, but that was for a table, Mr Speaker. That was for a table. And so I thought, I'm going to get—
Minister for Energy and Environment just might take his seat for a second. The member for Chifley, you're only just back. You don't want to be out again. I do allow a fair degree of latitude, but I listened to the question fairly closely, and whilst you can compare and contrast, I can't see what you're saying now is relevant to the question that was asked. You really need to, how can I say this politely, you really need to relate the material to the question that you've been asked. If the minister has the call.
Well, the reality is, Mr Speaker, when Kristina Keneally was the Premier of New South Wales, power prices went up. And power prices went up, and we know that Senator Sam Dastyari had a major role in the Labor Party in New South Wales at the same time. So now that Kristina Keneally is running for Bennelong, Mr Speaker, and Senator Sam Dastyari could be her future colleague, what will that mean for the people of Bennelong? Higher power prices, Mr Speaker. So when I saw that they're going to be hosting an event together, I thought I should book a table. But when I went online, what happened? What happened to the event? Suddenly, the Labor Party's website said the event was cancelled. The page you were looking for was not found, Mr Speaker. So suddenly, Kristina Keneally and Senator Sam Dastyari don't want to bring the old man back together.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. Are my questions to the Prime Minister? The Prime Minister promised that every Australian would have access to the NBN by the end of 2016. It's now the end of 2017. Prime Minister, how many Australians still do not have access to the NBN?
The Prime Minister has
claim the honourable member made, as I said yesterday, is completely false. What I said was that our objective was that there would be, by 2016, everyone would have access to 25 megabits per second. Not that the NBN would be completed by 2016. And of course, people have access to broadband in many different ways. Anyone on an HFC network has had access to 25 megabits for years. So, and many have had access to that on ADSL. So the honourable member, once again, just as he did with Mediscare, is misrepresenting, is telling falsehoods. He thinks he can get away with putting words in other people's mouths, and if he said it often enough, people might believe it. But the real issue with his shiftiness, Mr. Speaker, is just consider this. Just consider this. Consider his companion there, the member for Isaacs. This is the man who has gone after the member for Kooyong. He wants to argue. He has been out there arguing that Josh Frydenberg is a citizen of the country that, but for the arrival of the Red Army, would have pushed his mother into a gas chamber. That's what the member for Isaacs is up to. And they've claimed. He has. You doubt it. You doubt it. He's
the
read
Prime
it.
Minister will resume his seat for a second. Members on both the Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. Whilst this is a very hot debate on citizenship, I have to point out to the Prime Minister that the question was about the NBN, and has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The Prime. Okay. The Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice. Prime Minister.